Because you're right, the DA could walk away if they wanted to, but it's not going to collapse government. We'll have a reshuffle. And then we continue. The foreign policy is not changing. It's not going to change. It's one of our red line issues. Non-negotiables, that's what I mean by red line. But if we're also open and honest, is the SACP today what it was then? I think there needs to be an honest conversation about that. That's the first matter. And frankly speaking, we also cannot be pandering to a Western agenda.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today I'm extremely honored to be joined by ANC MP Fasiha Hassan. Thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Thanks, Israel. Happy to finally be on your show.
Yes. It's been a long time coming. We're very glad to have you. And wow, you are one busy MP. I was looking at how many committees you were sitting on. And is that normal?
Yeah, so when I first joined Parliament earlier this year, I was in 5 committees.
Yeah.
So for reference, most people are on 2. So I started off in higher education, planning, monitoring, evaluation, small businesses, electricity, energy, and JSC.
Wow.
And it was like Hermione Granger, time turner kind of stuff. Like start one meeting, speak at the beginning of the meeting, run across parliamentary precinct to the next meeting to speak at the end of the round. Glad to say I lost a little bit of weight, but now I have a much more manageable load. So now I'm in 3 committees. So I'm actually in electricity and energy. I'm in mineral and petroleum resources, and I've got Judicial Service Commission. And I'm also the whip for those 2 committees. So it's like kind of like political management, but you get a little bit more, I would say, hands-in kind of thing.
Yeah, really interesting. And tell us about what it has been like actually going to Parliament. You're part of the provincial legislature.
Yeah.
You're one of the youngest members of Parliament. What surprised you? What has excited you? What has disappointed you?
I'm thinking about how honest to be. I used to think admin was quite bad at legislature.
Yeah.
Parliament.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah, so you go like through university and different spaces, and you think, oh, okay, things will really be under control.
Yeah.
And actually entering was a little bit of a rocky road, and I wonder if it's because, which I still don't really get, because we're still 400 MPs, but I wonder if it's because of the changes politically. So that was the one thing. But actually, it's been very interesting. I thought it would be a lot similar to legislature, and actually it is very different, which I actually find interesting. So on a policy level, committee level, I understand how that works. But, you see it on TV, people calling orders and rules. The rules are very different. So just like getting your head around all of that, but also just trying to take in the moment. And that's kind of difficult because Parliament's still being rebuilt. So you're not, I don't know if people know this, we're in a tent in a parking lot. So there's no like beautiful view or like stunning pictures on the stairs or like this moment of, oh, I'm here, It feels sometimes a little detached. And it's interesting because you don't think about that. I never thought about how an architecture of a space can make you feel like you're actually in a space or that you're actually doing the job. So it's a little all over the place, to be honest. But I guess that's a new role, baptism of fire.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what are your thoughts on where we are as a country, and in particular, this interesting political moment in which we find ourselves, where there are new coalitions, there are new formations, and we're all kind of trying to find our way through what this new moment means?
I actually think it presents an opportunity for us, especially as young people. So don't get me wrong, it's anxiety inducing, it's difficult. We're all learning literally by the hour, by the day, on how to navigate the space. But actually, in as much as it is all of those things, it presents a unique opportunity for us as young people to say what kind of skill set is going to be required both in the political and governance realm over the next, probably the rest of our lives. And how do you build on those skills? So the ability to coalesce with different political parties, beyond just a socializing. How do you sort of lobby a political view, ideology, policy position, right? That's something we need to learn a lot better than before. But also, I think, agility. And this is something I don't think we've been very good at in our political realm. And I don't mean this as the ANC. I mean this across all political parties. We've been very stuck. I am this. This is my thing. And in terms of certain ideologies, I agree, it must be stuck. But in terms of others, you need to be versatile, you need to be agile. And I wonder if as millennials, Gen Zs, Alpha is coming, that's actually what we're good at. The ability to maneuver, the ability to, mold yourself to the current moment. And that's why I think, even though it's really hectic, there's a really unique opportunity that we as young people need to take advantage of.
Absolutely. And the cooperation with different parties, particularly the DA, how's that working in your mind? Like, as someone who gets to see it up front in Parliament?
I think it's different in the executive versus Parliament.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I think in the executive, there's different rules that govern the space. So you have a president, you have cabinet, there are these long-standing policy positions, and it's not easy to go in. I mean, think about home affairs, right? Generally. There's a line. There's several lines you have to stand in. There's several things you have to do.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the executive, it's a little bit more pronounced. Where I'm finding it more fluid, and maybe arguably more interesting, maybe because it's my daily life, is actually in Parliament. Because sometimes there's GNU vibes and sometimes there's not. In certain portfolio committees, people will be like, oh, you guys are throwing punches at each other. ANC at the DA and vice versa. And I think it should be robust. I think it should be like that because we're not always going to agree. And frankly speaking, we don't always have to agree. Where we are right now is that we have to find a way to provide a stable government, an efficient government, but that doesn't always mean that we have to kumbaya, hold hands and sing at the fire. And in Parliament, we haven't necessarily only done that. So it is interesting, but it's also, now you have people who are opponents and then you see them sort of glitch. It's a funny thing. So you're in a debate or in a discussion and they'll attack. And then all of a sudden they'll be like, wait, we have a DA minister, deputy minister. And then you'll see they glitch. They're like, oh, okay. Then the thing will change. So all of us are learning. And maybe that's why, even though it's been a hectic parliamentary period, it's a new experience for all of us.
It's actually true because yes, we have a coalition, but it's quite different to your standard coalition. Firstly, in the provinces, there are all these different arrangements. And then at national level, as you say, in the legislature, there's a more fluid arrangement. In the executive, there's maybe a more static, but even that is quite fluid. And it could change over the years. So we're in this moment of our political life where everything is new.
Yeah, and also everything is, you wake up and you think, this is what the day will look like. And then the day completely turns out differently. But that does show us the fact that things are very fast moving. In politics, things can change in a few minutes. Forget an hour, forget a day. And you always have to be alive to the fact that there's this, I wouldn't say it's an animal, but it's definitely sort of this creature, and it's not a party political thing. It's democracy. It shifts, it changes, and you also need to learn to adjust to those things. But also, and this is where I think we're getting to, we're not there yet, to lead the charge. So to say, this is where we need to go, and this is how we need to get there. And I think that's been an interesting process and challenge, and I think it's, unfortunately or fortunately, it's a part of a mature democracy. One election you're in, next election you're out, and you always have to learn to play both sides, opposition and in government.
So I'm developing this view that the ANC lost the election or didn't have a good election. But
we knew that one.
Yeah.
Hard hitting, thank you.
Fair enough. But won the negotiations. So from the position where the ANC was after the election to keep hold of the presidency, keep hold of the deputy presidency.
And critical portfolios.
The speaker, most provinces, even resurrecting in KZN. I mean, it's a masterclass, quite frankly. And I don't think the DA has figured out
that they lost the negotiation.
Yeah, exactly, that they've been completely outmaneuvered.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. In as much as people are very critical of the current ANC leadership, for good and bad reasons, one thing, especially the President Ramaphosa, his skill set, and we've said this a few times, he is the man for the moment. His political history was actually priming him for this very moment. Yes, of course, it was about the Constitution and CODESA and all of that's a whole other conversation. That was probably the most important negotiation of his life, of our lives. But it came through in this, a master tactician and negotiator. And often we don't look at the president in that way. We think of him in different ways. We think of former President Zuma as this master tactician. And I actually think very much what you've said, that President Ramaphosa and the negotiating team of the ANC were very, very clever, not only reading the moment, but how to manage the different personalities in the room. And there is something to be said about that. And I hope that we'll write about it, we'll study on it, because this is not the first negotiation. There are many more to come. And we need to learn how, I think, especially as young people, what sort of lessons we can take from that. Because, and this is another important point that I think we don't consider enough. We had a very peaceful transition again. If you look right now at Mozambique, if you look at other African countries, okay, Botswana, we're hoping will be a peaceful transition. We expect it to be. But there was, I think, some attempts or thoughts from nefarious elements in the country that we will not have a peaceful transition from a majority ANC-led government. And we proved all of them wrong, that we will fight for our democracy on every level. I mean, if you think about that Sunday when elections, just before they were announced, and some nefarious characters went to the results center, like, don't announce results. These are rigged. And we were like, no, actually. And this for me is a fundamental key turning point in the ANC's renewal. You have an ANC leadership through the SG who comes forward and says, we may have had a very difficult election at 40%, and it's painful, it's torn us apart. But what we will not allow is this country to descend into chaos. And we will accept this election result, and we will do better, and we will find a way to create a stable government. But we will not, under any circumstances, allow any sort of unrest or allow any sort of, agitating for something that doesn't need to happen. And I note this because we come now, because, now we're talking our parliamentary portfolio committees, but there was a moment in our history where it could have gone the other way. And that was just a handful of months ago. And I think there's another thing to be said about how that transition was managed in a good way.
Very interesting. No, I fully agree with that. I've been very critical of President Ramaphosa's domestic agenda, certainly in the first administration, but as a negotiator, unmatched. I mean, I look at this negotiation and I'm like, how did the ANC keep all of this? And I've also realized that the DA can shout and scream and kick and scream, but what are they going to do? Are they going to walk away? If they walk away, well, then you can just bring in another partner and then it's done.
And I think this is the thing, and this is why it's important of why we don't also use the word coalition. We say government of national unity, because it's not just with one political party. And I think that was also a master class kind of move, because you're right, the DA could walk away if they wanted to, but it's not going to collapse government. We'll have a reshuffle, and then we continue. The NDP, all of these important policy positions continue going on. I think I saw a tweet recently from someone. It was like all these DA ministers shouting all the victories that they actually delivering on an ANC manifesto. They're delivering on the things we said we would do. So it's actually, I think, a very important moment, but also, and we must also be, I think, introspective in this way, that it won't always be like this. And we need to learn from the moment, and we need to find ways going forward, of course, to bring up electoral results, but also to level up, for lack of a better term.
What do you make of those who say, for example, from the SACP, for example, that this collaboration with the DA is a selling out of key principles, and it's a step too far to collaborate with that kind of political institution?
Look, I think the SACP, whom as an institution, I think we all have a deep respect for. We understand the role they played in bringing about our liberation. But if we're also open and honest, is the SACP today what it was then? I think there needs to be an honest conversation about that. That's the first matter. Wow. I think it's important because the ANC is also not what it used to be, right? In the same way that we need to renew the ANC, we also need to renew the SACP. If we go into communities now and you ask a random person what's the SACP, especially a young person, they know who the ANC is. For positive or negative things, they know. But they won't know necessarily what the SACP is about. And I'm starting my answer this way because it's easy for the kettle to call the pot black, right? Without also deeply internalizing it. And I think there is, by the way, a space for criticism.
Sure.
I think there is and there should be, because hindsight is a perfect science. We may find that in the future this was not the best arrangement. We may find that it was a very good arrangement. But I do think there's a space in which it can be done. And there have been multiple, in fact, plethora of platforms for the SACP to raise it. And it is fascinating because if it is such a sellout position, perhaps they should recall their ministers and deputy ministers, right? And I think it's fine to be critical, but we must also do it in a way that builds, in a way that says, okay, now that we're in this current situation, this is a better option, or this is how you manage and maneuver. There's a reason why we are in where we are now. It's not because we didn't speak to MKP or because we didn't speak to the EFF or we didn't speak to these other political parties. We're in a very difficult, like you said, a very difficult rock in a hard place situation. And this was probably the best case scenario that we could come out with. But I think we should also be honest and perhaps a little bit disingenuous of some of those comments around it, because if it is such a sellout position, then you must pull out, right? And then let's find other ways. But the SACP is well within their rights to say it, and then we are also well within our rights to say, well, are we all doing the best we can? I think there's a question there.
Are you concerned, or are you witnessing or noticing that compromises may be going too far, or do you think that in actual fact there aren't the kind of compromises that some may have predicted? So, for example, we see on foreign policy, there are public debates, but I don't get the sense that the foreign policy has actually changed. There's a bit of noise from within the GNU.
The foreign policy is not changing.
Yeah.
It's not going to change. It's one of our red line issues, non-negotiables. That's what I mean by red line. And again, people are able to say all they want about whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's about Brics. But remember, when you're on a global platform, there's no ANC-DA. There's no EFF, ANC, etc. You are the South African delegation. The South African position is X. And that is very important, number one, for policy certainty, right? For investment, for business, etc., which we saw in New York very recently. President Ramaphosa rang the bell, and, it's all these metaphorical important things. But it's also important because South Africa on the global stage plays a very different role. We may not be the biggest economic player. In fact, we're not the biggest economic player. But we do play a fundamental role in terms of moral authority, in terms of diplomatic work. Many people don't know this, but South Africa is asked very often to step into positions where civil war has been negotiated out of, in different, not only in the Palestinian situation. You see this around the continent, around the world. And I think a lot of South Africans are not aware, actually, of the role that our diplomats play. And that's important because a GNU can't change the kind of currency we have, positive currency that we have in the global platform. And frankly speaking, we also cannot be pandering to a Western agenda. Right now, we're in a situation where we can determine what the future of this country looks like, for better or for worse. The problem with pandering to a Western agenda and accepting certain things that I think other GNU partners might want to, is that it takes away a lot of our sovereignty. And that for us, and I'm speaking also as an ANC Youth League spokesperson now, is a non-negotiable. We can never hand over our sovereignty in any shape or form to any other form of power, whether it's the West, whether it's China, whether it's Russia. And that's something that is really a no-go area for all of us.
That's such an important point, because I think we're at a moment now, maybe up until the last 30 years, there was only one game in town in terms of Western authority in the international system. And for a long time, as someone who studied international relations, I've thought this idea that, the West is in decline is a bit overblown. But when I look at events now in Russia, Ukraine, the Gaza catastrophe, Israel, Iran, I think we're starting to see a moment in the world where the West can't have it all its own way. It's still a powerful player, but suddenly there are new forces that are rising to challenge the West in a meaningful way. And South Africa is going to be key to that story in the next the next 30 years.
150%, right? And this is something that people need to understand. It's not about Russia, Ukraine, China, etc., the US. It's about creating a world that's multipolar so that there's more than one power player. So a US cannot unilaterally decide to go bomb the hell out of an Afghanistan or to, in this current circumstance, actively arm. They're not complicit in the genocide of Gaza and of Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing. They are not complicit. They are actively involved in it. They cannot, in this current moment, do it without us at least saying something, without us taking them to the International Court of Justice, without us saying it's not okay. I think there's still a lot to be done in terms of the ability to stand up to them, in terms of military power, that's all there. But what you are at least seeing is the global South saying, no, we're not going to allow it. And more importantly, we outnumber you. You're not going to decide what the world agenda looks like. Where you're wrong, you're wrong. The big, I think, message or what we have to learn now is we don't want to replace the US or the West with another power. We don't want China to take that and be the only superpower in the world. We want a multipolar world. We want everybody to be able to have a say. And I agree with you. South Africa, like I said, may not be the biggest economic player, but we are a heavy hitter in international relations.
No doubt about that.
Because of our ability to go into the playground, stare down the biggest bully in the playground, i.e. the US, Germany, Israel, and say, no, we're not going to be okay about it. We're going to speak up against it. And that's also perhaps one of the reasons why we are now such a big threat to Western powers. Not because we are close to them or because we can collapse their no. Because we are leading the charge of global South countries who have historically been underprivileged, underdeveloped, etc., who were always just shoved aside. We were always just extrapolated from, always extracted from. Now all of a sudden saying South Africa is leading the charge and saying, no, we're not going to allow it. And that's a broader process of decolonization the world over. And frankly speaking, Sizwe, I'm proud of that. I'm incredibly proud that our country can go into a global arena, punch above its weight, and say that the UN Security Council is flawed, it's biased, there's no African representation, and frankly speaking, it's a whitewashing to allow oppression to happen all over the world. And I'm proud that we are able to say that on a global platform.
Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. I agree, and I think Brics is actually a big deal. I think it's a bigger deal than many people have realized. After the Kazan summit, people, I think, are starting to realize now. And the way that we've got ourselves at that table is quite incredible.
We must actually thank God. Because when you look at the metrics on paper, you're like, how did we get the S in the Brics?
Well, that's what I want to come to, is that when you look at India, for example, for all its domestic problems, right? This is an economy that's been growing over 5% for 15 years now, right? Yeah. And they're really starting to become something of a global superpower in many ways. We have all the ingredients to really lead the charge towards this multipolar world. But if we're being honest, economically speaking, we are underperforming for a really long time. And we need to get ourselves out of this 1% trap so that we can play this global role. Because if we're not careful, the BRICS partners are going to look around and be like,
hold on.
South Africa, you're geostrategically important, but like your economy is stuck in stagnancy. And that's, I feel like that's where our conversation as a nation needs to go to. All this internal squabbling and whatever is well and good, but how do we collectively get ourselves on that trajectory to become an important global player?
Yeah. I fully agree with you. We're not always going to be able to ride off what we've just discussed.
Yeah.
And 1% or less than 1% growth is frankly unacceptable.
Yeah.
And there's a few things that we need to look at, right? And we have to look internally and domestically to solve some of those issues. The first is that you cannot bring about a developmental agenda under an austerity budget. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
And I say this now as a parliamentarian who actively wants to fight and fights with National Treasury because you want to perfect example, in Gauteng, we don't have enough schools. That's one of the reasons why our learner-to-teacher ratio is extremely high. Extremely, right? We cannot be having classrooms of 50 kids to one teacher.
Yeah.
So before we even get to employing more teachers, that's one thing. You need to build the actual schools and classrooms in order to do that. If there's no budget to do that, you can't build the schools, right? You can't get budget for teachers to populate those schools. And it's not just that. You need like a whole lot of money to grow the economy. And we don't actually have that in the fiscus. So it requires, number one, I think, a rethinking from National Treasury. And a lot of people are like, yeah, you guys are parliamentarians. You guys are the ANC. You should change it. If you read the Constitution, National Treasury is a constitutionally protected and recognized department. And they'll tell you that. We are the only department that will always exist. And I sort of get it, right? The trauma of those 9-10 years in which state coffers were completely plundered have created a culture there of distrust, not within Treasury necessarily, but to say, how do we know you are actually going to build the school? How do we know that the money is going to go to where it needs to? So that's the first problem, right? The second is that we need to think very clearly in how we leverage off the private sector. And this is again where President Ramaphosa, again, for all of his other flaws, is really good, because he's able to go to business and say, through Operation Vulindlela, for those who don't know, it's around opening up bottlenecks, removing red tape. And it's one of the reasons why we've gotten technically load shedding from Eskom is not there. Load reduction, we need to have a conversation about.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But it's one of the reasons why we're getting things back on. It's one of the reasons why PRASA is starting to run and reopening more than 26 pathways out of 40. These are like critical things, but were brought about because of leveraging business, who does have money, who does have an interest in getting the Transnet lines back on, because how do they move their product around the country? How do they move it from the port to and fro? So we have to be very creative in that way. And the last point where it does feed into this idea of a multipolar world, foreign direct investment. And we need to be careful, we do, about who we accept money from, but we do have to accept some money, because we cannot grow the economy without investment in infrastructure, without investment in critical skills, without investment in critical parts of the economy, because we cannot. It's actually, let me say it like this, it's completely untenable for us to economically grow at less than 1% and then think that we're going to be a global player and then think that we're not going to have unrest on the streets, because people deserve a better life and we need to provide that.
Absolutely. I suppose for our generation, one question is, I don't know if I'm in the same generation as you.
I was going to say that. Caesar's a little older than me, but I'll allow it.
Okay, so I hear you on doing the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
You know, foreign direct investment and fixing PRASA, Eskom, and thank goodness we have had lights for the last 7 months. But I do think there's a deeper question, which I don't have the answer to, and I don't think anyone yet has the answer to, which is, when we look at an India, when we look at a Vietnam, when we look at a China, when we look at some of the Latin American economies, even though they are hitting headwinds now, there's a view of developing economic independence and really doing something bold and new that takes you into a new economic era. I was in Japan a few years ago, and you know, from the ruins of the Second World War, you know, with some American help, of course, they managed to completely rebuild that society and economy from the ashes. And that's what we have to do, right? Of course, we have to get the short-term stuff right, but how do we, you know, build this economic independence so we're not reliant on the West or on China, and we actually start to create the economic powerhouse that this country can become, you know? And that's maybe a 30-year project, but if we don't get serious about it now, we may be left behind.
Definitely. And I think that's a little bit of the elephant in the room, right? Where, because our issues are so stark right now and they're so in your face, you think, along the terms of how do I immediately try and solve economic policy issues. When in reality, economic policy decisions you make today, you see the outcomes of years from now.
Yeah.
So I fully agree that we need to move towards an economic independence. And I also agree that it requires bold and courageous policy making.
Absolutely.
Bold and courageous spending, bold and courageous budgets, which is difficult in the current circumstance, right? And this is maybe where, and I will say it until I'm blue in the face, until I die, why we need new thinking, why we need innovation, why we need younger people and different people in the space, because we almost have no other choice than to do something different. Because if we continue on the current trajectory, we'll be shocked 10, 15 years from, guys, we're really not growing the economy. I wonder why it's so cyclical. I wonder why it's so structurally, structural inequality remains the way it is. And it will remain that way unless we fundamentally do something different.
And it may take some pain in the short term.
In fact, it will take a lot of
pain.
pain.
That's what we shy away from, I think. And that's what needs to be
And it will take sacrifice, right?
Absolutely.
Not only from state coffers. It's going to take sacrifice from, yes, the private sector money, but also from average South Africans, normal South Africans who every month we want them to rather invest in some sort of AI technology, for example, which we're not going to see now. We're going to see in the future. It's going to require a complete overhaul. And I think the problem, Sizwe, is that when you have such stark inequality right in front of you, when the cost of living is so high, when people are struggling to move, forget month to month, Sizwe, day to day, people are struggling. How do you then go back to that same community and say, let's think in a 30-year level? They can't think that way, not because they don't want to, but because the issue of losing a house, having to move their kid into a homeschooling situation, giving up things that, eating meat. People are having to give up eating meat or chicken.
Yeah, just food poverty.
Because, exactly. So we need to almost do both things at the same time. You need an excellent team who can deal with the short term. And I think we've got a good team already started work on that. But you also need long-term planning and ways to find the money to start investing in those infrastructures. And one of the things that we don't look at, but the financial sector in South Africa is very advanced. And maybe that's also a space that can help us grow the economy, not in terms of jobs, because we know it doesn't create as many jobs as we want, but it can make us an important player in the next 10 or 15 years and hopefully give us that kind of leverage in the Brics kind of situation.
To change tack somewhat, you studied law and...
Yeah. Join the leagues of, I'm trained as a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. And, you've used your legal training because you're now part of the Judicial Services Commission.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that's been like. For those who don't know, it's the body that recommends judges for appointment. You get to speak to anyone who wants to be a judge in any of the courts. And of course, looks like you have to read...
Oh my God, the reading.
Untold numbers of documents. But what's that been like, and how has it reshaped your understanding of the legal landscape in South Africa?
Yeah, let me be a little bit more vulnerable. JSC, the deployment from the National Assembly and ultimately the ANC was actually a surprise.
Wow.
I walked into... first sitting and someone sort of said congratulations to me, and I thought the person's being nasty because it was after the cabinet was announced and the executive was announced. And I just sort of found out by the way. And I actually think it's one of the most important deployments I've had to date because, and people don't understand this, if you have a judiciary that's very conservative, it means it can take you back. Look at the US, the so-called superpower, the so-called first world country, Roe versus Wade, the case that allowed abortion or termination of pregnancy to be legalized across the country, has been reversed. Where women around North America are now questioning what's next on the agency or autonomy of their bodies. We in South Africa have legislation that protects us, right? It's a choice. And that's always the point, right? A lot of people are like, well, how can you support abortion? How can you support? But the reality is that there must be a choice. If it's against your value system, you don't do it. But the point is you need to be able to choose whether you do it or not. And I cite this example because if you don't have the right judges on the bench, it can take you back. You can have BE taken back. You can have, termination of pregnancy, sure, but there are critical cases on capital punishment, on children's rights, on so many things. So you need a very progressive judiciary, and I'm very open in saying that. But it's also a hectic space. You mentioned it, the reading is, it's insane. Like each judge has to, or hopeful, will have acted as a judge, because you don't just arrive there. You must be recommended and sort of nominated, has their own judgments that they've penned. And then there's objections, and then there's the legal bodies the files. I mean, I know we don't think like this in paper, but huge. And the morning of the interview, there'll be this, and you'll be like, oh my God, what? How do I, and you'll see me, if you look at the videos, my highlighters are sprawled everywhere because I was like back at university trying to get through everything.
And the other members of the committee are also like extremely learned people. So
and that's my next point, that actually I had a lot of imposter syndrome. Major anxieties,
And you must be one of the youngest people to serve on the JSC.
Yeah, it looks like I might be the youngest person in a democratic, we don't count other stuff. There was no JSC then. But the youngest person ever to serve in the JSC. So, and I'm 30 now. And it's been, frankly, very daunting going in there with some of the real heavy hitters in the legal judiciary. Tebeka, one of them, of course, the Chief Justice. And really just sitting there being like, whew. Breathe, take a deep breath in, read, do your best. And I'm happy to say that there was a lot of positive feedback from many judge presidents, from the Chief Justice herself. And I think it also is testament, and they said that, to re-energizing the space, to shaking it up a little bit, because there were a few things where we were recommending judges, and I said, but you've not recommended a single woman. You've not recommended, youth, it's hard to say recommend an under 35 judge. We're not there yet. But again, it speaks to the fact that we need to be grooming and creating a better succession plan for more younger people on the bench, because the youngest person I think we interviewed was like 45. And everyone's like, wow, a 45-year-old being interviewed. That was the achievement. So there's a lot of work to be done. And the last point I'll say on this, the last few years I've been taught to think very politically, very much in terms of governance, in terms of all these. And it was so wonderful to go back to think a little bit more legally, to think a little bit more, and I wouldn't say technically, because my role on the JSC is different. There are heavy hitters whose job is to technically, on a legal level, cross-examine, so to speak, the candidates. Our job is to bring in the societal issues, the socioeconomic issues, the fact that if we're putting a judge on the bench, what kind of contribution to transformation have they done? What are they doing in terms of decolonizing the legal space? And frankly speaking, Sizwe, quite a number of the candidates fell short, because I think fundamentally it's not enough just to be competent, especially if you're coming from a privileged background. We need to know that you have done extensive work to bring in Black lawyers, to bring in Black juniors, to bring in young people into the space, because it's not enough for you to succeed. Because the legal fraternity, I'll say it, is an old boys club. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw you asking hard questions of people who had represented universities in the fees must fall days. And that stuff is important, because it carries a voice that hasn't been in that committee for a long time. And even though the judges may bristle at that kind of thing, that's
they did. There was a bit of oofs,
But those are the
Commissioner Hassan, we don't know.
You know?
Yeah, but I agree with you. And I think it's important, because as someone who's been on the opposite end, on the other side of the table of when a university or an institution brings heavy-hitting lawyers. I remember during Fees Must Fall, at WITS, Adam tried to use a referendum to reopen the university. And the question was, do you want to go back to class? And we're like, this is a flawed argument. We want to go back to class, but we can't go back to class until we have some commitment that those who are financially excluded, etc., etc. And so we go into the courtroom, and Advocate Mpofu is representing us. Yes, and the university, WITS, was represented by Senior Counsel Wim Traingrove. And he dismantled us and tore us apart and then rebuilt us in a different fashion. And the reason why I thought a question like that was important was because, like I said, I've been on the other side of the table where senior counsel and heavy hitters in the legal fraternity are used to intimidate students and to scare you. And if you don't have access to the same kind of lawyers, you're laid bare. And this is the big question. I know you're doing your LLB. This is a big question around morality, right? In the legal fraternity. It doesn't always mean progressiveness. It doesn't mean, apartheid was legal.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It was legislated. It was legalized. Detention without trial was legalized. It was not moral, but it was legalized. And the point I'm making here is that you need a kind of legal thinking that is activist in nature.
Yeah.
And I'm not ashamed to say that. I know the legal fraternity may scoff at it, but the reality is, in the same way we're fighting on a political realm, the fight must continue on a legal realm as well.
I agree. And it's a noble tradition of legal activism, which we have inherited. That is also part of the ANC tradition as well.
Yes.
Activist lawyer. Fees must fall, now that you mention it. I mean, how long ago is that?
Oh gosh,
now?
it's 9 years this year, but it's
Yeah.
going to be 10 years next year.
Wow, we're going for the 10
I know, I'm as shocked as you.
Yeah. How do you reflect on that crucial moment for the country and your life nearly 10 years later? I mean, it's a moment in our history which was so important for advancing a new conversation, but which also left so many personal scars that maybe we haven't fully uncovered at this point, and I don't know if it's been fully told.
Yeah, I think the 10 years is snuck up on all of us, or the 9 years.
Yeah.
And it's also because you're young, you're in your early 20s. I think I was 21, 22 at the time.
Wow.
Yeah. And you have the sense of, at the beginning at least, some sense of invincibility. We can really change the world. Like, we can really make a meaningful impact for the now 62 million South Africans, right? Because you first think, oh, just about WITS, just about UCT, just about Univ and TUT. And then you realize, no, but this thing is bigger than that. You can change millions of lives.
Yeah.
And you juxtapose that feeling with the harsh reality of the police brutality, of the great sacrifice that many untold names that have not come to this point to sit here with us in this room have sacrificed and lost. And you juxtapose that with how far have we really gotten? And one carries that burden on a daily basis because perhaps that was our generational mission. We want to grow it, right? We don't just want to fight in higher education. We want to fight beyond it. But you sit in portfolio committee, especially at the beginning of this term when I sat in higher education. I no longer sit there, but and there have been many gains, one of which on paper is that NSFAS is a grant and that they've expanded access.
Absolutely, yeah.
Big one. But at the same time, you sit there and you think, what would Fasiha at 21, 22, having led Fees Must Fall at that point, what would she say to this Fasiha now? And it's a deep moment for me, and I'm still, I think, unpacking it. Because we're all radical and young. And also remember, at that time, you had different considerations. Now, when I sit in electricity energy. And I'll give you a very good example. The current electricity tariffs that Eskom have asked for are incredibly high. And there's a number of reasons for this, one of which is legal, by the way. The AfriForum case has forced NERSA, that's the body that determines electricity tariffs, it has forced NERSA to use a cost of supply mechanism. Now that sounds on paper, it makes sense. Cost of supply does this because we have historically underpaid for electricity.
Right.
Now you have a huge amount asked for. 36.15%, if I'm right. It's going to change. It's not going to be that, but that is what is asked for.
Oh my.
Now you look at the fiscus. Let's say there's only 10 rand. Now we must fund higher education. We must fund healthcare. I'm sitting in electricity energy. Now people cannot pay a 36% increase in electricity. It is not tenable. And the minister said this, it's not tenable. Now you think, hold on, if we only have 10 rand, we've got to support the healthcare system. We've got to ensure that this electricity tariff is cushioned, especially for the poor. And then you sit there and you are so angry, Sizwe, on a daily basis, because that shouldn't be the conversation. It should never be that we are putting up healthcare against electricity or higher education against social development. Never. But because we are in the situation that we're in, you are. And that's why I don't know if you can see, like, I see it about it because at 21, 22, we called for free education. We call for it now. But how do we implement it? We haven't changed our view system, our value system, our ideology, the things that took us to the street to fight. That at that moment when we were about to be arrested, when you were about to lose the ability to practice law, when you were being shot at, when you were being tear gassed, that same thing is there in Parliament. I feel that every day. But the tactic has to be different. Because I can't protest in a parliamentary portfolio committee. My job is to represent 62 million people, or maybe less if you look at youth, right? But 35 million people, young people, who need me to not only read those documents, but to find a way to ensure that as we're doing all of this, we're creating jobs. We are creating a stronger economy. We are ensuring more access to education. And I'm citing this because it's a daily fight in my mind, in my heart, in my soul. Because when you're an activist, it never changes. The tactic may change. The site of struggle, Parliament, is a site of struggle. It's there. But you learn very quickly that the world is a very ugly place. And that in order for you to institute true change, it may take our entire lives. And yes, we did incredible things in a few years, but we're not done. And the truth of the matter is that it's going to take every single one of us in all of our spaces to change things. And that's why maybe I'm a lot more pragmatic now. I'm a lot more, I don't think sober is the right word. I think I'm a lot more solution orientated. If you had interviewed me 10 years ago, I would have been like, the state must find the money. And yes, the state must find the money. But now I'm like, right, which fund can we look at? How do we platoon in universities so that we can double the amount of students we're getting through? But then at the same time, you don't want to just create graduates that are unemployed. You know, and it becomes this constant, you know, people when they talk about burnout, I do wonder if any of us, yourself included, have fully reflected on the fact that we haven't stopped fighting for more than 10 years. And it's exhausting. And every time you think you're making a dent, there's like another big crisis and abyss, and you just like, Jesus Christ, like how do we bring about the kind of structural change that we really need? And maybe that sobering moment of we'll push our entire lives, but I have to believe, and we all have to believe that it will one day happen, because right now it's just not enough. And maybe that's, sorry, I was like verbal diarrhea, but just that 10 years of, I don't know. I don't know how I'll feel next year when we're looking at the 10-year mark, because there's just so much to do. And I don't think we've done enough.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. What troubles me about that period and how it's looked back on is that we put people under these like impossible standards of being perfect individuals, and then everyone got criticized for not being perfect enough, and
ourselves included.
Oh yeah, I mean, and the question is like, where's the space for grace as well? Like, to criticize something in society doesn't mean you have to be perfect. It just means that, you know, because if that's the standard, then no one can say anything ever. And
nothing will ever change.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of unfair criticism that passes for you know, critique. When in actual fact, like, everyone has a combination of ambition, social commitment, and trying to figure life out, and not knowing what's going on.
And trying to adult at the same time. Like,
and it's a bit sad to me that people of that era don't get the credit they deserve in some ways for doing something great, because I don't know, they went into corporate spaces or they went into politics. Like, what are people supposed to do? Like remain perpetual activists? I don't know.
Maybe we were meant to remain at WITS for 10 years.
Well, that's another option.
In this,
some
but
of us
it's not an
are
option.
back at university.
Yeah, but you didn't stay there's growth.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Sizwe. As somebody who has also been the target of many a criticism, some fair, some unfair, I fully agree with you. What were we meant to do? Were we meant to stay at WITS and every year try and lead a mass protest? Or were we meant to, when the opportunity came, say, and I mean, this is what happened in 2018. The ANC leadership, and I mean, I've always been an ANC member. This is not new information.
Yeah.
I got into the SRC through the PYA. And
you were criticized for being in the ANC at that time because there was a lot of criticism of the ANC.
Correct.
And you stayed in the ANC on principle.
Yeah, on principle. And the principle being that if you exit the space, there's nothing you can do, right? And that's why in 2018, after having resigned, I started articles, resigned. It was, corporate law is not for me, very racist ways. But after having resigned, the ANC said, well, you guys spoke and jumped up and down a lot.
Yeah.
Are you ready to put your money where your mouths are? Because now we can give you opportunity and space where you can be at a decision-making table. We're not there yet. We're not in cabinet. We're not where we need to be yet, but a seat at some decision-making table so that you can bring about some implementation of what you were saying. And so, yes, there was criticism for that, but I don't regret it, Sizwe, because it's not about ambition. I could easily have gone to do, which was the plan actually, to do a master's and then go do pupillage, become an advocate. That was the streamlined career for me.
Sure.
And this opportunity through God's plan and whatever happened, we were there. And so for me, it was more of an extension of my activism, right? So how do we take the protest from the streets into the place where the decision is made, into the space where the budget is determined, into the space where you say to the minister, but this is unacceptable. It cannot be that university residences are outsourcing to a South Point and people are being kicked out. Your activism must grow. And I think, even a self-critique of myself at that time, we didn't have room for growth, right? It was so black and white. We talked about nuance, but we didn't see nuance. And then when the time came for that nuance, some people went for it, some people didn't. But the reality of the matter is that if we didn't enter into new spaces, how are we going to fight other issues? In Gauteng, we passed the first piece of legislation, provincial legislation, that was about the Gauteng Township Development Act, right? Developing localized economic development. And that was when I was chairing the portfolio committee. And I'm citing this example not to blow my own horn, but to show that activism must continue. Because the last thing that we did, and we must be honest about it, is we created a very toxic environment. In both fees must fall, roads must fall, open Stellenbosch. We created a space that no longer was appealing to the masses. I mean, I remember being physically pulled off stage, I was in a meeting, mass meeting, being on a chair and being like, you need to leave. And I said, no, I'm also a student here. Like, you don't have to like me, but I have something to say, to contribute. And if we're really going to change, at the time, the WITS and the decolonization movement, you have to hear from all of us. And then they picked up my chair with me on it and physically threw me out.
Wow.
So I'm citing these examples purely because we created spaces that were no longer open to not only students, but to young people in general. We created spaces that were not conducive for fundamental change. And one thing the ANC's gotten right, maybe less so now, but we've gotten right, is for change, you need a massification. You have to massify your struggle. Because if it's the 10 of you guys in the Anthropology Museum, I don't know how much we're going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's an interesting reflection, and it's a chapter in our history which we probably haven't fully digested. Looking to the future, firstly, were you disappointed that you weren't in cabinet? Because I thought for a second President Ramaphosa was going to do the right thing.
Who knows, Caesar? There's still time.
Yeah.
There's still time. Yeah, look, there were lots of chats about it. Some I can't really speak about, but there were chats about it. It didn't come through in the end. And maybe also for the right reasons for me. personally. I am learning about Parliament. I'm learning about how those processes work. And I'm a firm believer in there's a plan, right? God's plan, Allah's plan, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in it because if it was meant for me now, it would have come through. And if I can tell you, Sizwe, I got calls on the day from senior people to say, did you get the call?
Really?
I obviously did not get the call.
Wow.
But we were very close. And when the time is right, it will come. And even if it doesn't prevent us from changing things. It doesn't prevent our activism from growing. It doesn't mean I'm going to jump ship or, close up shop.
So you won't be announcing that you're joining MK Party on this podcast?
Yeah, no, like before I came here, there were many people who said, so what are you going to reveal on Zizwe's show? And I was like, nothing that exciting yet. Look, I maybe it's because I'm an idealist. I still do believe we must do what we can to try and save the ANC. And I've been consistent about this. Not everyone agrees with me. And I'm happy to come back to the next show in 5-10 years' time and reflect on, I said these things, but I do believe that. And I do think there are viable spaces opening up, but I still do fundamentally believe, even at 40% Sizwe, that if we are at the decision-making table, we can influence what the GNU looks like, what policy looks like, what implementation looks like. And whether that is in cabinet or outside of it, whether it's in parliament or outside, you're not going to get rid of us that easily.
Finally, where do you think the ANC needs to go from here? Because it seems to me that it's at quite a crucial turning point. But this could be an opportunity as well for the party. I mean, either basically...
evolve or die.
Yeah, literally. Like if 2 more bad elections like this and I mean, there's nothing left, right? But at the same time, this could be the shock that the party needs to really fundamentally reshape itself. And that will require, after President Ramaphosa, a whole new outlook and a new crop of leaders. What do you think the ANC needs to do going forward here?
If you look at the ANC's history, the ANC has thrived out of crisis. And moments like this where it's do or die. And it's not necessarily the healthiest thing in terms of growth, but it does show an organization, and I don't think people understand this, right? Unless you are in the ANC or ANC adjacent, in the mass democratic movement, it's larger than yourself, and you are taught that. It's not you.
Yeah.
You don't make into cabinet, nobody cares. What's more important is ANC policy, ensuring that there's implementation of the NHI, etc. You are taught that this thing is so much bigger than you. It existed well before you became a thought process or were born. It will exist well after you. And your job as a custodian of this great movement is to bring it to new levels. And I think this is the thing that really hurt a lot of us who fundamentally believe in the value system, the true value system of the ANC, that people can come in with their own greedy kind of benefit, label that ANC politics, and then jump ship it and then be like, MKP, right? Leaving us with effectively a shit show, right? But maybe it's not a bad thing. And I even said this during elections. The creation of these different splinters actually means that the people we were trying to get rid of, who have a different value system to us, are now there. And that's fine. They can jump and shout and scream and claim they're radical as much as they want. But when they did have state power, they stole money in the billions, in the trillions. They didn't save the masses of our people. They didn't create economic opportunity. They didn't build more houses. They didn't put in more public healthcare. They took that money, put it in their pockets, bought their Gucci shoes and went to Dubai. So, with that said, this is the moment. We evolve or we die. And I want to be a part of a process that is bigger than us. And it may be the fees must fall thing. It may be just to say that you want to 10 or 20 years from now know that you did everything that you could. And so coming back to your question, what does the ANC need to do? We are very good at diagnosing the problem in the ANC.
Oh, yeah.
We have mahutla on mahutla. Why did we lose elections? What's this? Where's that moment? So I don't think that's the problem. The problem is that we need to be very radical, like we said about the economy. We need to open up this process and say, is one person, one vote how we need to go? Do we need to restrict ANC membership? I mean, these are all ongoing discussions. Do we need a certain minimum standard for you to be an ANC member? This particular cohort of parliamentarians and MPLs, that's provincial legislatures, we went through a rigorous process of interviews. And it was challenging. I mean, they asked like hectic, even I was like, the Constitution, like, hold on, let me think, And the point I'm making is that there are these movements. The wheel is turning, but the wheel is not turning fast enough. And that's where we need to come in. And Sizwe, I'll say it here, and I've said it to the ANC leadership, I've said it even into the president. We evolve or we die. It's now a choice almost. And I do think that this current electoral outcome is a shock. At first, it was a bit paralytic. People were like, oh, what do we do?
I can imagine.
But
I was even shocked.
Yeah, I mean, we were like, we thought it was going to be bad, but like, this, But again, it's opened up the space. And I'll close on this. It's very easy from outside of a space to throw stones and to say that we need change. It's more difficult, Sizwe, being in that body, standing up to corruption, standing up to malfeasance, standing up to the really, really big bullies. And for those who don't know, I've started doing that, much to my political demise. But I think also an important lesson for all of us that sometimes it's not enough to just say it from the outside. That living it in the space is often more difficult, requires more courage, but is what is required. Because those big bullies who have tainted and poisoned the ANC are the same people who are not expecting people to stand up to them, to say, actually, F you. You know what? You're not going to be able to buy me. You might be able to try and intimidate me, but we're going to stand firm. Because it's actually not about you. It's about 62 million South Africans, but millions more who deserve a better life and who deserve an ANC, not necessarily only of old. Yes, we want an ethical, glorified ANC, but maybe what we need is a new, modern, different type of evolved ANC that is more responsive to the needs of our people, but also more agile, particularly to young people, and particularly to what we're faced with now. And I would like to think that that is possible and that we should be a part of it. And even if it's not, we must do everything that we can, not only to rescue the ANC, but to rescue our country. And one commitment I will make, like I say, till I die, is that this will always be my priority. Serving the people of South Africa, often at great personal risk, definitely at great personal loss, but it is our generational mission to save the country, and it's yours as well. And I would like to think many of the people who are watching us, it's not all doom and gloom. The issues are not insurmountable because there are enough of us who are willing to change it, and we will.
Well, Fasiha Hassan, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX, and thank you for the great work that you continue to do.
Thank you. I feel like I should say something controversial, like I actually like pineapple on pizza, or like,
okay, whoa,
I know, too much,
yeah, no.
Too much.
Even SMWX will not tolerate that. No, I mean, this was ultimately a Sacred Heart chat, so shout out to all the Sacred Heart people.
Yeah, and also, maybe just also to say that there are spaces, like Sacred Heart and others, where there are microcosms of change, where we can achieve a society that is truly non-racial. People say anti-racist, it's very much similar, but a society in which we can create equality.
It's doable.
And Sacred Heart perhaps is a reminder that that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we look forward to all the great work that is to come, and thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Thank you for having me. I must be back so I can reveal something
definitely
controversial about myself beyond the pineapple on pizza.
We're always here, but there was quite a lot of controversy. I think we did well.
Waiting to get in trouble later.
Yeah, exactly. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Comment down below and keep it locked. Help us get to our next milestone of 200,000 subscribers. And stay tuned to SMWX. Aye.